Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. Welcome back to another weekly video of the Summer Embroidery Stitch Along. We are on week 6, which means we will be learning how to do the whipped backstitch. I mention this when I'm doing the tutorial on the whipped backstitch, but I don't mention it right at the beginning. So I'm going to throw this in here now in case you're one of those that start stitching right away as I'm demonstrating. The whipped back stitch is worked on a foundation of back stitches, which we learned in week 2. There really isn't any difference when you're laying down your foundation of back stitches. However, if you are one of those stitchers who tend to make your back stitches really short or really tight, you might want to ease up just a little bit. It makes it easier when you do the whipped part of the stitch, and you'll see that as I demonstrate it. But just thought I would mention it when I'm doing the whipped back stitch and I start by doing my back stitches. I don't do anything differently. But in the back of my mind, I'm always cognizant of the fact that it is easier if my stitches are just not quite so snug, if that makes sense. And you'll see as you practice. You don't want your stitches super loose, so I don't want to over-explain it as I tend to do. But just wanted to throw that out there. If you're one of these that start stitching right from the beginning, I don't mention the whole length and tension of the back stitches until I've stitched for just a little bit. Okay, so let's get to stitching the whipped back stitch. Again, all of my housekeeping notes. There will be a link in the description that takes you to a blog post that has links to all the past videos. If that makes it easier to go back and find a particular week, you might want to bookmark that blog post. Otherwise, the videos currently are all public and they're on the YouTube channel. There's also a playlist where I have just the Summer Embroidery Stitch Along video. So that should make it easier if you're skipping around on stitches or you just happen to find this video by accident scrolling through YouTube. Welcome. All right, so let's get stitching. For the whipped back stitch, we begin by laying down a foundation of back stitches. We went over the back stitch in week 2. If you need to refresh your memory on how to do the back stitch, you can go watch that video. And I'm using the 5-weight pearl cotton in color Easy 36. And I'm doing the back stitching just like I would if that's all I was gonna do for this shape, was just the back stitch. And after the back stitch has been completed, then we're going to go back and do a second step. And that's what makes it the whipped back stitch. So you can find an area on your panel where you want to stitch the back stitch and go ahead and do that. Whoops. And then I will show you how to do the whipped part of it. But you can find an area where you've already stitched the back stitch and add the whipped part of it later. So after we do this, finish this demonstration, after I finish this demonstration on how to do the whipped back stitch, If you want, you can go back to some areas where you've done just the regular backstitch and change it into a whipped backstitch. I've laid down my foundation of back stitches, and I started here and ended here. And now we're going to do the part of the stitch that turns the back stitch into a whipped back stitch. Now, since I'm stitching in an area where the beginning and the end, there is a beginning and an end, it's not a continuous line. When I start this next part of the stitch, I'm going to go back to the beginning. So what I did is I finished off my thread, and then I got a new piece of thread because I want to make sure I have enough to go all the way around without having to stop and get a new piece of thread, if that makes sense. Now, when you do this next part of the stitch, you can either do it in the same color as you stitched your back stitch, which is what I'm going to demonstrate here, or you can use a different color. Once you have your back stitches all laid down, you're going to bring your needle up from the back right next to where that first stitch line is. You're going to do it right next to it, kind of off to the left, and pull up to the front. And then we're going to just whip around all of those back stitches that are already there. And from here on out, until we get to the end, we are not piercing the fabric at all. We're just doing all of our stitching on the top of the fabric. So you're going to take your needle and you're going to run it under that first stitch from right to left without piercing the fabric. And you don't want to pull it super tight as you go around. And then I'm going to just keep doing that with every single back stitch that's already laid down. So this is the first stitch that's gone down. So now my thread is over here on this side. I'm going to take my needle again on that other side. I'm calling it from right to left. And I'm going underneath that stitch. Again, my needle is not piercing the fabric. I'm not going to the back of my fabric. I'm doing everything on top. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. And I'm saying from right to left. It just depends on how you're looking at your design. And also because I'm filming this for YouTube, and the display ratio is sort of a horizontal rather than a vertical, but I've got my stitching in front of me, and so I'm saying right to left. If it makes it easier to think of it as top to bottom, that's fine too. The main thing is you just want to be consistent and go in the same direction each time. So you can see how I'm just going under that back stitch that was already there and pulling my needle through and my thread through. And after you've done a few, you'll be able to see why it's called the whipped. We're just whipping around all of those stitches that are already there. And I'm trying not to pull it too tight. You know, I want you to be able to see the tension and the whipped part of the stitch. If you find that the point of the needle is getting stuck either on the thread or you're accidentally piercing the fabric, you can run your needle with the eye first rather than the point. A lot of people will recommend this. I find it doesn't always work so well for me. I don't know, it just seems to be more of a pain. But you can do it this way if that helps, so that you're not piercing the fabric. It also helps if your back stitches are not super tight when you lay down your foundational stitches. It helps, it makes it easier to run the needle through. Now you don't have to have them super loose. When I stitch these, but when I stitch the back stitch, if you remember, or if you're paying attention, you'll notice I was just doing the back stitch just like I did in the regular, when I was demonstrating the back stitch in week 2. So we're coming to where we're turning a corner, and it's the same concept. It's just, you just have to remember your stitches are going in a different direction, or, they're angling off a little bit, but I'm still taking my needle kind of from the inside to the outside, if that makes it easier to kind of visualize. Now you'll notice when I'm doing this stitch that I am not making any loops with my thread. So my thread's back here. It's not behind my needle. You want to make sure that you're not forming any loops when you do this. You're just whipping it around each of the back stitches, but you're not really forming any loops. I am approaching my last back stitch. So I'm going to take my needle through like I did all the other back stitches. And then I'm going to end it by just sort of putting my needle right next to that last stitch where that last stitch goes in. And there you have it. That is the whipped back stitch. Here's a close-up. You can use this stitch anywhere that you would typically use a back stitch. If you compare it to the back stitch that I did over here, you can see it just gives your stitching a little bit more depth and texture. So you might want to use it in areas where you want a little bit of a thicker stitch maybe, but you don't want to do the chain stitch, because the chain stitch can also be used anywhere you would use the back stitch. And it does give texture in dimension as well, just a different type. So it's another good stitch to have in your stitch toolbox, your library of stitches. I want to show you what your stitch might look like if you're using two separate colors. So this leaf right here, one side of the leaf is a darker green than the other side. So what I did is I stitched the back stitch in a lighter green, and I'm going to go back and do the whipped part of it with a darker green. And let's see what that looks like. So the lighter green that I'm using is color EZ34, and the darker one is EZ35. Now I could also have decided to stitch the back stitch in a darker color and then do the whipped part in a lighter color. Or what might be really fun is to do half of the leaf in one color back stitch and the other half a different color back stitch, and then use the same but different color for doing the whipped part. Anyway, there's just all different kinds of possibilities and varieties that you could do with changing colors of thread and even weights of thread. All right, so I've got my back stitch already laid down, and I'm going to come up here. I'm going to come to the top, kind of at the base of that first stitch, and I'm going to run my needle under the stitch. And because I'm doing a whipped motion, I'm going from right to left, top to bottom, however you want to describe it. And I'm making sure that all my stitches will go in the same direction. So I did the first one, now I'm doing the second one, and I'm just going to keep going. So yeah, that's just a different look that you can get with the whipped back stitch using different colors. So those are two different examples of how I stitched the whipped back stitch on my panel. There are so many other fun places you can do it on here. And you can also, if you look back at some of your just quote unquote plain old back stitching, you can go back and add the whipped part if you would like. Have fun stitching, and I will see you next week.